Did you know that your muscle mass, strength, and even more importantly, muscular power may predict how long you live as powerfully as many lab tests and even some classic risk factors? In massive studies of nearly 2 million people, those with stronger muscles had about 30 to 40% lower risk of dying over follow-up compared to the weakest groups in these studies, even after adjusting for age and lifestyle. And people with low muscle mass have about a 36% higher risk of death from any cause, plus higher cardiovascular, cancer, and respiratory mortality. Today on the Vitality Manifesto, we're going to show you why skeletal muscle is one of your most important longevity organs and exactly how much strength training seems to cut the risk in the best available data. So stick around, because by the end, you'll know what you can start doing this week to literally shift your mortality curve and extend your health span. Welcome back to the Vitality Manifesto. I'm Dr. Dwayne Jackson, and this show is about evidence-based strategies to extend your health span. So you don't just live longer, you live better. If you're serious about staying strong, sharp, and independent into your 80s and beyond, then please subscribe to the Vitality Manifesto podcast. Hit the like button so this message reaches more people. And before we start, drop a comment right now by answering this one question. How many days a week do you currently lift or do resistance training? This not only helps the algorithm, but it most importantly tells me where you're starting from. Now, for today's question, is muscle mass and strength a stronger predictor of mortality than many risk factors we obsess over, like BMI or normal body weight? So let's start with what the science actually shows. And we're first going to talk about the question, if my weight is normal, I'm fine, am I? Well, I want to really impress on you right now that being thin really isn't enough for extending your life. The problem is that BMI, or body mass index, can't really see what you're made of. And this is fat mass versus muscle mass. A powerful cohort study done in the US with over 11,000 adults used DEXA scans to measure actual muscle and fat. And here's what they found. At any body mass index greater than or equal to 22, people with low muscle mass had more body fat, more diabetes, and higher mortality than the people with the same BMI but more muscle. When researchers adjusted for muscle mass, the so-called obesity paradox, it almost disappeared, and the BMI linked to best survival shifted down into the true normal range. So two people can be both normal weight. One is lean, muscular, and metabolically healthy. The other is skinny fat, low muscle mass, high body fat, more diabetes, and higher risk of dying. Now, on the flip side, pooled data from 7 large cohorts with over 16,000 people showed that higher fat mass was associated with 56% higher mortality at the top end. Now, higher fat-free mass, which in this case is mostly muscle, it was associated with 30% lower mortality at the top end. Here's an actionable for you right now. When you have some time and some money, go out and get a DEXA scan. This will provide a relatively accurate estimate of your body composition, including visceral fat and bone density. It's well worth the cost. Okay, then, so how much muscle really matters? Well, a 2023 meta-analysis pooling more than 878,000 participants found that people with low muscle mass had 36% higher risk of all-cause mortality, 29% higher cardiovascular mortality, 14% higher cancer mortality, and 36% higher respiratory mortality. And this was all compared with those with normal muscle mass. And that relationship was dose responsive. They found that as mid-arm muscle size went down, mortality went up in an inverse linear fashion. Now, other large cohorts echo these findings. In a US and Haynes cohort, higher appendicular or limb muscle mass was independently associated with lower mortality, even after accounting for BMI, waist size, smoking, activity, and chronic disease. In the UK Biobank, a cohort of 356,000 adults, mortality had a J-shaped curve with both muscle and fat. Now, what this means is those with low muscle mass and high fat mass carried the worst outcomes, whereas moderate to higher muscle mass with lower fat mass was associated with the lowest risk. Now, this also applies to older adults. In a geriatric cohort, they found that those with low muscle plus slow walking speed had over 4-fold higher mortality versus their peers with more muscle and faster walking speed. To put this in perspective, across nearly 1 million people, low muscle mass is a clear, independent risk marker for early death. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting. Muscle strength often predicts mortality better than muscle size. A 2018 meta-analysis, including about 1.9 million men and women, found that people in the highest grip strength group had about a 31% lower risk of death than those in the lowest group. Now, this association holds true regardless of age. In older adults, the NHANES data show that low muscle strength roughly doubles mortality risk in people 50 plus, whether or not they have low muscle mass. In the classic health ABC study, strength, not muscle size, predicted mortality. Quadriceps strength strongly tracked with death risk, and CT measured muscle area did not, once you kind of adjusted for all the confounders. And a recent prospective study from the Clinimex cohort, almost 3,900 people aged 46 to 75, well, they found that those in the lowest muscle power category had roughly 6 to 7 times higher mortality than those in the highest power group. And this was after adjustment. Muscle power outperformed pure strength for prediction. Now, muscle power is your ability to use strength quickly. So it's not just how much muscle you have, it's how strong and powerful that muscle is. Okay, now this begs the question, how much strength training do you need? And people often ask, okay, how much lifting do I need to do to live longer? Well, a 2022 systematic review and meta-analysis of cohort studies answered this pretty nicely. They looked at adults 18 plus, and then they followed them over time for major chronic diseases and mortality. And what they found was that doing muscle strengthening activities, things like resistance training with weights, bands, or body weight, this was associated with about 10 to 17% lower risk of all-cause mortality. Also a 10 to 17% lower risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes. And the dose response curve is key. Risk reduction seems to peak about 30 to 60 minutes per week of strength training work. And according to the study, more than that didn't add clear further benefit in the observational data. It formed a J-shaped curve for mortality and major diseases. Now, this does not mean strength training 3 days a week or greater and for longer sessions doesn't reap other benefits in other areas, say like muscle hypertrophy. So don't just start cutting back on your training because of these data. If you really want to increase the health span, it was also found that when people combine strength training with regular aerobic exercise, the risk of death from all causes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer was even lower than with either alone. So a realistic longevity prescription based on the current evidence looks something like this. 3 sessions per week, 20 to 30 minutes each of properly performed resistance training, plus regular walking or other aerobic activities. Now, we're going to now go into a relatively controversial question. Is muscle more important than cardiorespiratory fitness? Now, an overview of meta-analyses representing more than 20.9 million observations across 199 cohorts found that cardiorespiratory fitness is an extremely strong mortality predictor. Now, when we look at high versus low cardiorespiratory fitness, cohorts had 53% lower risk of all-cause mortality when they're fit. Now, every 1 MET increase in fitness results in about an 11 to 17% lower all-cause mortality. Increasing fitness by 1 MET means that your body can use about 3.5 more milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body mass per minute during maximal effort than before. In plain terms, it's a small but meaningful bump in the engine size for your heart and lung system. For an average adult, a 1-MET gain or metabolic equivalent often comes from a few months of regular aerobic exercise like brisk walking, cycling, or jogging, depending on where you're at in your fitness, and is enough to move from, say, struggling with a brisk walk to handling that same walk more comfortably, or say for those that are just starting their fitness journey, being able to climb an extra flight of stairs without stopping. When we compare the data on cardiorespiratory fitness versus muscular strength, the meta-analyses show us that high versus low strength, roughly 31% mortality in the general population. In chronic disease groups, cancer, COPD, renal disease, vascular disease, low strength often doubles mortality risk. So what does this mean? Well, both cardio fitness and strength are powerful, largely independent predictors of how long you're going to live and how well you're going to live. Now, the strongest overall signal in the literature is cardiorespiratory fitness, but muscle strength and power are not far behind and often holds predictive power even after adjusting for fitness. So for longevity, you want both engines running, your heart and lung system and your muscles. This is why the strongest mortality benefits show up when people combine aerobic and strength training. Now, another key insight is that muscle quality may matter more than we thought. Muscle isn't just tissue volume. As we age, muscle can fill with fat. It's a process called myosteatosis. Now, in the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis that was conducted a few years ago, people with the highest muscle density, so less fat in the muscle, had about a 60 to 70% lower mortality than those with the lowest density, even after adjusting for BMI and visceral fat. In fact, muscle area or size alone did not predict mortality after this adjustment. Now, a 2023 AI-driven CT study in nearly 9,000 asymptomatic adults found that myosteatosis carried an adjusted 1.9-fold higher risk of death, independent of obesity, independent of liver fat, and type 2 diabetes. In fact, it outperformed simple obesity measures as a mortality predictor. So clinically, we're moving from how big are your muscles to how healthy and fat-free is that muscle tissue. So this supports focusing on protein intake, progressive resistance training, and overall metabolic health. We're talking insulin sensitivity and inflammation here mostly, because all of these influence muscle quality and not just quantity. Now, I want to stress that the story doesn't stop with healthy populations. In clinical groups, muscle status is often a life or death situation. A 2019 meta-analysis of 39 clinical cohorts with about 40,000 patients found that low muscular strength was associated with approximately 80% higher all-cause mortality in chronic disease populations overall. In cancer patients, low strength more than doubled death risk. Every 5 kilogram higher in strength we are reduced mortality by roughly 28% overall. In critically ill COVID-19 patients, a 2025 systematic review of 20 studies with a population of 1,818 people showed that high muscle mass was associated with a 26% lower mortality risk. And survivors consistently had higher skeletal muscle area and higher muscle quality when they imaged them. And cancer specific, well, a 2025 meta-analysis of 47,000 patients showed that higher muscle strength or cardiorespiratory fitness cut all-cause mortality by about 31 to 46%, with strong effects even in advanced stage lung and digestive cancers. So whether you're healthy, living with chronic disease, or facing critical illness, muscle strength and quality are powerful predictors of whether you survive and how well you really function. Now, let's break this down to concrete, evidence-aligned advice that you can use and share right away. Based on the abundance of evidence, don't chase weight, chase body composition. Aim for more muscle mass and less excess fat. And a normal BMI with low muscle and high fat is not a safe zone. Hit 30 to 60 minutes of strength training per week. As a starting point, I suggest at least 3 sessions per week, 20 to 30 minutes each, hitting major muscle groups. That's the range linked with the 10 to 20% lower risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer mortality, and strong reductions in diabetes risk. Now, add in aerobic work for maximal effect. Combine strength training work with walking, cycling, or other cardio to harness that very large mortality risk reduction seen in those higher cardio fitness cohorts, up to about 50% lower risk in the high fit versus low fit groups. Train for strength and power, not just size. Use controlled multi-joint lifts or compound movements like squats, squat variations, deadlifts, presses, rows, these types of things. And include faster, safe movements for power appropriate to your level. For example, brisk sit to stands in older adults and lighter explosive lifting in younger individuals. Remember, low muscle power carried up to 6 to 7-fold higher mortality in those recent data. And measure what matters. So grip strength is pretty easy. You get a cheap dynamometer. It's a validated mortality predictor. Gait speed, chair stands, timed up and go, all correlate with survival. Support your muscle biochemically. Make sure to hit evidence-based daily protein targets. Aim for about 1.2 to 2.2 grams per kilogram body weight per day, which is about 0.55 to 1 gram per pound body weight per day for your protein intake. The actual sweet spot sits somewhere around 1.6 grams per kilogram per day or 0.73 grams per pound. Manage insulin, manage your insulin resistance and your inflammation. All of these are tightly linked to muscle wasting and sarcopenic obesity. A good way to test this is when you go to get your blood labs done. Test fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin, and HbA1c for insulin resistance, and then couple that with HSCRP for inflammatory status. Now, there's a few guardrails I want to put out there. We can't say that adding X pounds of muscle will extend your life by Y years. Those are associations, not randomized controlled trials. And more is not always better if it involves anabolic steroids, extreme bulking, or other harms. Those populations are not what these studies measured. Now, as we close out this segment, let's recap the key takeaways. Across hundreds of thousands to millions of people, low muscle mass and low strength are consistently linked to substantially higher mortality, independent of body mass index, and many classic risk factors. Muscular strength and power often predict death better than muscle size alone. Muscle quality and function are very critical here. Cardiorespiratory fitness and muscular strength together provide some of the strongest lifestyle predictors of longevity that we know. I suggest around 60 to 90 minutes per week of strength training, especially when combined with aerobic activity. And then finally, a normal body weight with low muscle mass and high fat mass, or the classic skinny fat phenotype, is high risk and not a free pass. And with that, this wraps up another episode of the Vitality Manifesto podcast. If you found this helpful, please hit like so this message gets prioritized by the algorithm. Subscribe now to the Vitality Manifesto podcast for deep dive, evidence-based episodes on building a longer, stronger life. And please drop a comment. Let me know the one change you're going to do to make or build or maintain muscle this year. I'm Dr. Dwayne Jackson. Thanks so much for listening to the Vitality Manifesto podcast. Remember, muscle isn't just for aesthetics. It's a vital organ of longevity and health span. And I'll see you in the next episode.